this is what the kind of thinking that we need in today's world. We need thinking that is really inclusive of other people's habits and behavior. So we have another question that says, I've read that open organizations don't really work from the top down. What does that mean? And how does it change my role as a leader?
I'm going to start actually at the end of this question and come back. So if we think about our role as a leader, I think it's important to remind ourselves, no matter what our leadership leveling is within an organization, is that we need to remember that there's a lot of shape shifting involved as a leader, which means you might have to fly above like the bird to look down and get that, that big view of the landscape. And sometimes you have to shape shift back down to a different level to be able to see that micro, what's happening, right? So keeping that in mind, that we have to kind of go up and down and look at different perspectives is really important as our role with that. But when I hear it doesn't work from the top down, I think sometimes that can be off-putting for those that feel as though they're stuck in a position of, well, the type of industry that we're in, we have to remain hierarchical, or we have to do it this way. And I think the first thing to remind people is that our open principles and the way open works are there's levers or dials. It can go up, it can go down. Those dials change based off of whether we're talking about internal versus external. So there are a lot of things to look at here. But what I find fascinating is if we think about how, throwing back in about mathematics and fractals, things I really don't know much about, but if we look at the fact that patterns emerge, like order emerges from the bottom out, or how it can, and how that's replicated in nature, I think it gives us things to kind of look to and fall back on, that when we empower people and empower our teams at the quote unquote bottom, they begin to work in different unique ways that then is replicated by other teams. It's reproducible, and their consistency as a team can become reproducible. So we start seeing this effectiveness to where the only word in my head is infiltrate, and I don't like that word. It sounds very gross, but that is embedded, then maybe is a better way. It becomes embedded, and then naturally, organically becomes, it grows throughout an organization.
I'll just attach myself to using a word that is maybe not one that I should use when talking about this, but open behavior, modeling open behavior is infectious. As people, as a leader, if you model those behaviors, other people begin to model them as well. And if you see them and you provide positive feedback and really call out when somebody is working openly, that excuse me, that becomes infectious inside of an organization, because what openness allows people to do is to bring their full self to work, really focus in on the things that they're good at, that they like, have a joyful experience at work, and that is something that then other people kind of want to be infected with. Now, Bryan, you should
that sense of agency. That sense of agency you're talking about is really, really big.
Mm-hmm. What do I need to do next, Laura?
You need to bring in another I word.
Oh, okay.
But
not infiltrate, not
infiltrate, not infect. But I guess it should start with INF.
Okay. Let me see what emerges when I talk about emergence. I think this question reminds me actually of a question we, I think, answered previously on this show that we received about the relationship between open and no rules, right? I think somebody asked once about, I think, is open antithetical to rules? And I think this is a great way to explain that relationship is it's not mutually exclusive, right? The top down dynamic that this question is asking about is one approach to rules. In open organizations, we found that those organizations work best when order is not imposed from the top down, or from a central figure in a hierarchical way down toward the periphery. Instead, they work better when order emerges out of local interactions and bubbles up, as you've already said, right? So my favorite book on this topic is Emergence by Stephen Johnson. But it talks about the way that patterns emerge out of seemingly chaotic behavior, and where local interactions and local systems can spur global organization, right? And Laura gave a great example of how that happens. Jen talked about how that happens. Stephen Johnson takes a look at like ants and human cities and things about ways that, patterns emerge. And it's not that the open means no rules. It's that open allows rules to emerge out of local interactions and is sensitive to that emergence, right? So this is sort of the leaders. The second part of this question asks about the leader's role, and the leader's role no longer becomes about necessarily just setting the rules and dictating from the top down, so to speak. This is the metaphors of the hierarchy here. I think this person's asking about, dictating rules and procedures that everybody has to follow in lockstep, but about paving the way for those local interactions, right? So the example I always think about here is that in an academic building that we used to work in when I was a professor, the building's door was here, right? And the sidewalk went like this. You had to come over here and then go turn the corner and go into the building. Well, what do you think everybody did? Like, nobody went like this and like this to get to the door. They just walked across the grass and went to the door, right? And so the sidewalk went like this, but there was this dirt path that had been worn through the grass where that was on its way to the door, right? And eventually they just paved over that, made a path that went to that, so nobody tripped and that it was easier to get to the door. Because it didn't make as much sense to go this way. It made more sense to just go directly to the door. But what the leaders did on the university campus is not necessarily dictate, the best way to get to the door. They watched what other people were doing and adapted to that local behavior to make the path more clear. And I think that's always a good metaphor for me anyway, is as a leader in an open organization. What are you doing to make the path more clear? What are you doing to make the path more concrete? What are you doing to make the path more obvious for people who have already chosen the best way forward, in your organization? That for me is what it means to not necessarily operate in a top-down way.
I think the other piece of this is around decision making. Because if you are an open leader, then part of what you've done, if you're successful at it, is you have empowered people to make their own decisions. So you really create an environment of distributed leadership, and people have the agency to make decisions. They are not afraid to make decisions or to enact certain decisions. I think that the idea that people at the bottom, I don't really like the top bottom. Like, I find it really hard to talk about to talk about hierarchy.
That geometry is odd in an open organization for sure.
Yeah. There's but the idea that everybody can choose to walk the path, and not stand there on the edge and say, oh no, I see other people have gone that path, but I'm afraid. If that's the situation, then then the culture inside the organization hasn't gotten to the point where people feel empowered to walk on the dirt path, to extend the metaphor.
It's actually a great way to look at it, right? Because it's like, oh, I don't want to break the rules. There's not actually a paved sidewalk here. What should I do? Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. That culture that's, kind of goes back to other episodes. We've talked about trust and how do we have these kind of conversations and these sorts of things. And I think it's a fantastic way to look at it as a leader. Mm. Letting the paths open up and then seeing which one really is the most effective, and then we go with that.
Yeah, there's some movement on this theme, like in city planning. There are some groups thinking about how to do urban planning that are really, they're starting to use more like things from the technology industry around user research and, really like understanding the users, where they're literally sitting there and watching where the people are walking before they put down the sidewalks. And there's some examples of this happening in like city parks and stuff, where they designate a green space. This is going to be a park someday, but instead of getting a city planner to imagine what it should be like for everybody in the city, they open the green space and then they study what the people want to do. They study where, the parents tend to take the kids or where the dog walkers tend to go. And then they design the open space based on, what the people are actually doing. And I think that's a really, to go back to other questions that we've answered, I think that's this is what the kind of thinking that we need in today's world. We need thinking that is really inclusive of other people's habits and behaviors, and being an open leader is really about that, I think.
That reminds me of the other question we just did about time, how open takes time, and thinking about like the city planning, for example, is there is a bit of an investment of time to determine the strategy of what we move forward with, but look at the time savings ultimately of having a space that is, we looked at what the community wanted. We sourced that feedback essentially by even just observation and looking at the data and the phenomenon of watching what the community needed and wanted. And then taking that and implementing it. Now you actually have a space that's used and it's done the right way, and it's done in a way that fits the culture of the people in that community, right? And then, less time of investing money and time and thought and all the other things into something that's not useful and effective.
Yeah.
And I think
yeah,
what an example we can use.
Yeah. And, it pays off because, if you put the trash cans where the people want to, dispose of their litter, then they're not going to be littering in other places. They put it in the trash can, right? So, and that means that you save on the maintenance on the other side. And we're talking in metaphors here, but I think these are really strong metaphors for open organizations and open community initiatives. Because we're seeing how things like, city design is changing based on more public needs, rather than, the dreams of somebody sitting in an ivory tower with really nice architectural pencils.
Well, but even the trash can analogy here makes me think about it how open allows you to solve problems you didn't think about, right?
Exactly.
So like the implementation of the location of a trash can solves other things for you, right? That you currently weren't thinking of when you said, let's have a green space. What are we going to do? And so that if you follow along the whole metaphor trail here, this really makes a lot of sense and really supports why more open organizations.